Hey, everybody. So glad that you're joining us today on FBC Missions So That podcast. Today, we have one of our perspectives instructors, Nicole Parks, with us, and it's going to be awesome. So I hope you enjoy. Welcome to FBC Missions So That podcast. This is an encouraging place to hear how God is working in and around us. We know that He blesses His people so that they can bless the world around them. Join us as we discuss how to join God in all that He is doing. Why is God working in our life, church, and community? It's so that through us, the world will know that He is near. All right, so glad that you're joining us today. We've got a great guest here with us. Her name is Nicole Parks. Welcome, Nicole. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you here with us. You did an awesome job with Perspectives this morning, lesson 7.
Thank you.
And we're so glad to get to know you a little bit. And so we got a half hour here or so just to introduce you to our listening audience. And we're excited to see how God's been using you and kind of where God's taking you now.
For sure.
You've written a couple of books. That's really awesome. But let's just get started. So tell me, how did you get involved with Perspectives? That's always a great start.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of backstory that I have to share before I get into Perspectives. In 2014, I ended up on 2 short-term mission trips with my church. One was to the West Bank of Israel, and one was over to China. And on those 2 trips, God completely wrecked me, broke my heart for the Unreached. And so when I came back from those trips, I was looking for a way to get involved with missions. How do I walk in what I feel like God is calling me to when I knew I wasn't called to pack up and move overseas?
Well, maybe like that's, how did you get to China though? Like, have you been a Christian your whole life? Like, how do you get,
okay.
Like, we're going to start with, we got a half hour, so we can't go all the way back, but you're like, listen, it wasn't Perspectives, it was China. Okay, wait a second.
Okay.
How do you get to China?
Let me back up a little bit further then. I'll back up. Okay, so I was not raised in a Christian home. We'll start there. I think I always wanted to have a relationship with the Lord, but I didn't know what that looked like. And so I didn't actually start walking with the Lord until after college.
Okay.
And at that point, I ended up at a really big seeker-friendly mega church outside of Atlanta and really started to grow in my faith at that point.
Okay.
So my introduction to short-term mission trips was, I thought that it was, hey, you get to travel for free and do cool things for Jesus. I was like, heck yeah, sign me up.
It's literally the glorified vacation kind of idea. Like, this is going to be great.
Instagram summer, Christian wanderlust, whatever you want to call
Perfect.
it. That's what got me in. So ended up on those 2 trips in 2014 over the West Bank of Israel, working with Palestinian Muslims. And then 4 months later, serving at a medically fragile infant orphanage in China.
Oh, man.
And so those 2 trips absolutely wrecked me for the Unreached. Of course, I didn't know it was the Unreached at the time. But
I mean, those are huge trips in and of themselves. They're really not your normal level 1 thrill seeker mission trip. That's a big deal.
Yep.
Those two places and interacting with those type needs really does bring you to the forefront of what we would call mission frontiers. Like, you're really right at the edge of where people are willing to even consider going, and the needs are dramatic.
Sure.
So obviously that touched your life. It impacted your heart. Were you married at that time?
Yeah, at the time, my husband and I had been married for, let's see, math is hard, for probably 8 or 9 years.
Okay.
So we had 2 kids. We had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old.
Okay.
So yeah, it was hard to do.
Were they going with you guys?
No.
Oh, God.
Definitely not. My oldest was 3 and 1. And so we went to the West Bank together, me and my husband.
Okay.
My mom is a saint, and she comes and she takes care of the kids. Even to this day, she's watching the kids now.
That's awesome.
And she says her role in the Great Commission is to watch my kids so that I can go travel and do these things.
Listen, there are grandparent roles that are so desperately needed in so many ways. So it takes the whole church to reach the whole world, and this is one of those spaces.
It takes a village. So my husband went with me on the first trip when we went over the West Bank, but then I went to China without him.
Okay.
And so through those 2 trips, I knew that God was calling me to something, but I didn't really understand what it was, because I didn't have any accurate biblical theology on the Great Commission at that time. I really just didn't know. And so I started looking at what would it look like to be involved in missions without just trying to go on short-term trips all the time and without packing up and moving overseas.
Sure.
So I started looking, and I ended up finding a ministry called Cafe 1040. And so this is a mobilization ministry. We work with the next generation. Our heart is to see disciples of Jesus in every nation, tribe, and tongue. And we do that by helping lead the next generation to tell the story of Jesus where it's never been told. So I joined their staff, and I was able to do that stateside. So I was a mobilizer for a little while. Then I led our stateside team. And it was because, going back to your original question.
We've bounced around already.
I've gone through my whole life story there. When I joined the staff of Cafe 1040, they require all of their staff to take perspectives. And I wasn't super excited about it, to be honest, because I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I was support raising for my new job. I was trying to figure this whole new calling thing out. And they were like, by the way, you're going to have to take this class. It's 3 hours a week for 15 weeks, and the closest one to you is an hour away. And I was just like, you got to be kidding me. This is required? But I did it, and it's so funny. The first lesson was so mind-blowing to me that I called my husband, and I literally just regurgitated the whole thing on the hour drive home. And so today, lesson 1 is one of the ones I teach the most, and I always talk about how that was probably the first time I taught lesson 1.
It's your rehearsal right there.
Was when I told my husband.
The guinea pig on your lesson 1.
Yeah. So then I took it in 2015. My husband took it in 2016. And then we coordinated a class together in 2017. That's when I started teaching.
Yeah. Wow. That's like a shotgun blast into perspectives.
Yes, it was.
But it wasn't just for taking the class. It had some serious impacts on how you engage. So you've been with Cafe 1040 since then.
Yeah, so I've been involved with them for 10 years now. And when I first started the job, kind of a funny story. It wasn't funny at the time, but started my job, and my son, who was 2 at the time, broke his femur one day. And he ended up in a full body cast for 6 weeks, right?
Speak a cast.
Yes.
Ask me how I know that.
Oh, no.
My daughter broke her femur as well.
Yes.
So go ahead.
Man. That's so funny that we have that in common. So because of that happened on an Urbana year. Okay. Urbana, big missions conference, happens every 3 years. This was like an all hands on deck, all staff thing for our ministry. I couldn't go because my son is in this massive cast. And so I stayed home, and I was like, well, I just got funded. I just started this job. I've got to do something. And so that's when I wrote my first book.
Okay.
Yeah.
And tell we got 2 books that you've written. So tell me how that process. You're just sitting at home taking care of your son. You're like, I'm bored. I'm going to write a book.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
This is how I work. So the first book was really birthed out of Perspectives Truly Changed My Life. One of the most life-changing things of my entire Christian journey was the Perspectives course.
Sure.
And I knew that anybody that took the course would love the course. The problem is getting people to do it. The only reason I did it is because I was required to. Yeah. I don't know that I would have committed, to be honest. And so I started to think about, God, how do we get this information in a smaller dose as like a lead in? Like some people just need a stepping stone. And so I wrote this book. It's a 7-part study on God's heart for the nations. It's the whole biblical basis for missions in a very digestible format. And so it's called For God So Loved. And it gets at the very end a little bit into the unreached and the state of the world. So it's really kind of a lesson 1, lesson 9. Here's why you should take perspectives.
I love it. I have looked very closely at your book. It's fantastic. It's available on the 1040 Cafe 1040 website. It's also on Amazon. You can see it lots of places.
It's on my website, NicoleParksWrites.com.
Yeah, check it out. And it's really a great personal Bible study. Got lots of really great tools. If you haven't taken Perspectives, this would be a really good intro to kind of get the concepts and the ideas. There are many people who have made efforts like that. We were looking at Jeff Lewis's God's Heart for the Nations just a few weeks ago, and I've written one too. It's a 7-part series, and it's similar in the concepts, and it's just so neat to see kind of everybody feels this same thing. Like if Perspectives is going to only appeal 8 to 10% of the population, if that, then what do I do with the other 90? Like, how do I give them the same heart
Yeah, this is a mandate for all of us. So.
Super difficult to do.
Yeah.
And so Perspectives cringes every time they hear these conversations.
But it's not a replacement.
It's not at all.
Worry.
It's a great introduction. And it really, we've been talking, I was a regional director for Perspectives here in Texas from 2010 to about 2013.
Okay.
And in that time, even then, this is what, 15 years ago, we're having conversations about Perspectives Light. How do we get this in the hands? Yes. It was just on and on and on, and the argument just never ends.
Yeah.
You've got incredible writers that understand why all of this content has to be a part of this, or else it loses. And they're kind of right.
They're right. The content is
you
so
lose,
good.
You lose something, but you've got to give people somewhere to plug in. So I love it. It's an excellent resource. And if you're listening, you should check it out. It's really neat. Today you taught lesson 7, and it was the first time you've done lesson 7.
I would never have taught lesson 7 if you hadn't asked me to come to Texas and teach lesson 7.
I remember our conversation. You're like, oh, sorry, I don't do that. I'm like, well, how would you feel about working on it? You're like, well, let me think about that.
In all my free time, yes.
I'm so glad that you did. You did an excellent job. If you're not part of that Perspectives journey, you may not know that the first 5 lessons are biblically based. The second 3 or 4 lessons are really historically based, and then you get to kind of cultural and strategic. But this historical section is if you're a history buff like me, I love it. This stuff is like, but my wife took the class. She was like, this history part is driving me crazy. It's like this dragging. So sometimes you get stuck with all this information that people are not all that interested in.
Right.
And so trying to breathe in energy and life into lessons 6 and 7 and 8 is always challenging. So you did a great job. I want you to know that. I've taught the lesson a bunch of times, and I don't think I've ever taught it better than you did today. So it was really great to see you walking through it. And there's a couple of big takeaways in it. Mm-hmm. Defining that pioneer missionary. The idea that there's this level in which people go, they start, they partner. Like there's this process all the way to the point where we get to be a part because they invite us to. Mm-hmm. And I think that process alone opens people's eyes to the reality of how often we seem to go and act like we're going to be there in charge forever. Yeah. And Americans are not particularly well accustomed to handing off authority, backing away, and even getting out of the way if you're not invited. But when you look at some of these historical lessons, some of these, there's some of them that are just overwhelming. Are there any that stand out to you that just really pique your interest? The
lessons?
Yeah.
I enjoyed this one so much. And I couldn't even remember what my takeaway was from this lesson when I took the class, but preparing for it, I kind of had this sense of like, this is one of the most understated lessons, I think, in all of Perspectives. Like
you said it today, that Ralph Winter said this is the most important lesson, the key lesson in the course.
And I loved lesson 6 when I took the class, the eras, or the epochs.
The
different epochs. I remember that one. I love that one. I think what I understood better about this one this time that I just didn't get the first time around is the entire mentality shift that happened when Ralph Winters in 1974 shifted everybody's focus from geography to people groups. And I love the scriptures. I love diving deep into the scriptures. And so to really get into that, this is when Pentata Ethne, all the nations, was really understood and unleashed. And it's just, he gave this one talk and it changed the whole trajectory of how we do missions.
It did. It's funny because we heard Becky Lewis talk about it this summer, and she said nobody listened, and then she's like, but 5 years later, there begins to be this. So she's like, even at the address he gave at Lausanne, it doesn't seem to be all that impacting. And then today we look at it 50 years ago, the movement from the last 50 years has been so ridiculous that they're calling it the greatest 50 years, right? The great 50 years. And
which makes sense because we've got the right focus now.
Well, what's wild, and maybe we can give like a really short synopsis here, is you have the launch of William Carey, 1792, what we would call the birth of the modern mission movement, right? We could talk about the Moravians, and there's all of those other people that were kind of on the periphery there, but that really pushes it forward. And really his writing, right? The inquiry is really what set that.
Yeah, and he basically just said, get out of the walls of the church.
What can we do? What means can we use to take heathens the gospel? And everyone's like, we can't. That's God's job. We don't do that.
Yeah, exactly.
He did it. Right after that, really within a few years, you've got Adoniram Judson, about 30 years later, you have Hudson Taylor, and you start to see these big shifts. So the first era he talks about is to the coastlines, right? And you start to see these missions that are on the coast of India, on the coast of Africa, on the coast of China. But that doesn't complete the work. They thought it was. They thought if we can just get a beachhead, then that'll be the start. We don't have to do anything else. Yeah. But that's not how it worked, right?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we get to the next guy. Hudson Taylor kind of is the key leader there, and you've got the inlands. So you have China Inland Mission, you have Africa Inland Mission, David Livingstone and others, and Sudan Interior Mission. You talked about that as well, and they thought, okay, now we've gotten everywhere. Right? Yeah. There's churches planted on the coast. There's churches planted in the interior. And like you said, they were ready to start pulling missionaries off the field. We have accomplished the mission.
They were ready to start celebrating.
Global evangelization has taken place.
Yes, because they had this misunderstanding of the scriptures where it says all the nations. They thought it was geopolitical. And so like I shared today, they would have said, oh, well, look, there's some Christians in Pakistan, so we can check Pakistan off the list. Well, when we focus more on people groups than on geography, we see that Pakistan's only 1% Christian. And that's a heavy load for that small percentage to have to evangelize. So there's still missions work needed in the country of Pakistan. But if we focus on that geographical understanding of nations, then we miss that.
Yeah. And you just, it really is not a big jump, but you realize that third era, that's, Cameron Townsend and those guys, when they realize, listen, by having churches in one ethnic group, there's still major linguistic challenges. There's cultural barriers. For sure. And they will never jump those barriers unless someone goes. So then it goes from 240 nations that need the gospel to now 17,000, probably 8,000 language groups, right? 17,000 people groups.
17,280 unique people groups. Yeah.
And really, Ralph Winter in 74 is the one that finally said, what about the hidden peoples, the places that no one else is, there's no one advocating for them. At this meeting, no one is speaking up for them because there's no believers among them. Right. How are we going to get the gospel to them? And man, in July, we got to see what that progress looks like. We've gone from, I think it was 40% of the world's people groups having access to the gospel in 74 to close to 80% today having access to the gospel. 75, I think, was the chart they showed.
Yeah, so there's been amazing progress, and at the same time, there's still a lot to be done.
Still a lot of work to be done.
But I also feel like the work to be done it's not as daunting as it used to be. The evangelical church worldwide, we have the resources, we have the people, and we have the knowledge to complete the Great Commission in our lifetime. That's
where you get to some of these big statistics coming up, right? Where like at Pentecost, you had one believer for every 300 something people groups, right? Now you have how many believers? 300 believers for every one people group, So it really is. We're on the cusp, and you kind of feel it. There's a momentum growing, and it's really fun to be a part of, especially to see the global church stepping up into its role. Sure. And so most of the missionaries sent out today are from the global south, not from the global north. Yep. Seems like we don't know that as Americans, but it's a really cool thing. So it was so fun just kind of seeing people's hearts slide up today. Your energy, your vision, your ability to kind of walk through what sometimes can be tedious content was excellent. Thank you. So tell me a little bit about your other book. So people were really interested. I don't know, you have a few left for tonight. I was afraid you weren't going to have any left for tonight. You got two small classes, and we're going to sell out their books before tonight. So I'm glad you have some in reserve.
There are worse problems to have than selling out the books. But yeah, I feel like about 8 years ago, God gave me this vision to write this book about Israel's missional calling. And this is a lot of what we talk about in perspectives, right?
Yeah, of course.
What was Israel set apart for and called for? They were blessed to be a blessing. They were called to be a light to the Gentiles.
I just want to tell the readers, we have not had this conversation yet. So I really don't know where we're going right now, which is fun. I'm excited. I think I know where you're going because I know the content well, but I haven't read your book yet. I have had it on my shelf. I got it a few weeks ago, but I'm excited to read it. I've never seen someone write from that perspective. Most American, even any comparisons to the calling of Israel is quickly shifted to how it relates to the calling of God's people today, the church, right?
Yes.
And so tell me why did you stick on that? Is it really an Old Testament focus on God's mission for the nations?
I think it is trying to help people understand why exactly Israel is called the chosen people and what they were chosen for. And, I think that the reason we haven't talked about, the reason that there aren't more books is because whenever you say the word Israel, people get like, oh, is this political? Is this
It immediately brings political
right?
connotations, especially today, right?
Yes,
Especially
gosh, it's the worst today. I didn't want this book to have any political affiliation at all. This is strictly
When did you write
theology. I wrote it.
It didn't publish last month. I just want you to know this isn't since
it published in December of last year, but
2024.
24,
okay.
Yes. And I wrote it, honestly, okay, God gave me a vision to write this book 8 years ago.
Okay.
And I felt like at the time, I'm pretty sure I said this in prayer, God, I am unqualified to do this. You need to pick somebody else. And over the last 8 years, I didn't even know, but he was preparing for me to write this book. So when it came time to finally actually sit down and write it, I wrote it in less than a month.
Awesome.
So it just kind of poured out of me. And it's all the scripture. It's what we talk about in perspectives. It's what we've been teaching about with the biblical basis for missions and all of that. And so I think that people don't understand why Israel was called the chosen nation, is called the chosen nation. I think that a lot of people have this really superstitious misunderstanding of the Abrahamic covenant and how it actually affects the church today. And so, honestly, one of the biggest things with my book, with the biggest perception, I guess, is that people will say, well, is this Zionist or is this replacement theology?
And there's no either. It's either or.
It's either or.
Uh-huh.
People have this dichotomy of Zionism or replacement theology. And I say it's neither. It's neither, because both Zionism and replacement theology are based on the understanding that God has a favorite and that he picked a favorite arbitrarily.
Right.
But the book
at the expense of all the others.
Yes. The book is chosen for a reason. Yes, this nation was chosen for a purpose. That purpose now includes the church. It's not replacement theology. We're not replacing Israel. It is a calling. It is a purpose. It's been God's heart since the beginning.
I imagine, again, I haven't read it. I imagine there's some fun parallels through the writer of Hebrews and how he ties all of that together.
Yes. And Romans and Galatians.
I just can't. I've taught through Hebrews a number of times, and it's one of my favorite books. It's one of the last books of the New Testament as written, right? And so I love how it, in some ways, kind of encapsulates all of the arguments into one kind of space that puts Christ at the middle. You know, he's the center of the whole thing. He is the ultimate Israelite. He is the ultimate descendant of Abraham. And in that, we are grafted into, not replacing the ones who, but grafted into that chain. And then the Hebrews writer, it makes it really clear that those who were of Israel who didn't know God were not of Israel at all. You know, like this whole kind of the nation of Israel represents God's people throughout history. Yes. And the nation or the church today represents God's people throughout history since Christ, and it's both and all in betweens, and everyone else, right? The nations that were the focus of the Abrahamic covenant are the same nations that are the focus of the Great Commission.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I think that some people will have a tension of, well, how do I reconcile this with my eschatology, my end times theology?
It gets so messy.
I know, it gets so messy.
The 144,000 and who they are, where they're going to come from.
And so what I say in the book is like, I don't like eschatology. I don't think it, I just don't like to get into the weeds of all that. But here's what I highlight in the book. There are really two times where Jesus is asked about end times where he actually answers. One of them is Matthew 24:14.
Yeah.
And he says this gospel of the kingdom will be preached as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And so they were asking him, how are we going to know when the end is coming? And what are going to be the signs of the time? And he says, preach the gospel to all nations. And that's it. And so he shifted their question from when and how to, no. You just get back to worrying about the task at hand, okay? Then the same thing happens in Acts chapter 1. They say, are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? So they're still asking kind of the wrong questions. Yeah. And he says,
they're looking for the conqueror.
Yes, he says in response, that's not for you to know, the dates and the times and all that, but Like instead of the question you're asking, rather than what you're asking, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So both times that Jesus actually responds to an end times question, he reshifts the conversation to the Great Commission. And so that, if that's the only thing you take away from my book, I will applaud and woohoo! Like that is a huge win right there.
Well, here's the thing. I said this to a whole group of people just the other day. I said, every single sermon leads you to one of two ends. One is either be faithful, follow me, right?
Yeah.
Abide in Christ. It's all about being faithful to who God's called us to be, understanding all of the different ways he wants to transform us, and we're moving from glory to glory. Everybody has a way to grow. Everybody, there's no one without all that. One of those things, that or be fruitful. All right, I'll make you fishers of men. So it's either that you're growing in your faith in Christ and following him better, or you're engaging in the mission of God and working alongside him to accomplish his mission among the peoples of the earth, which could be your family, your neighbors, your classmates, your coworkers, or maybe the people that live across the ocean that you go and visit as often as you can. But it's really one of those two things.
Yeah.
And that mission, when I've taught through Revelation a time or two, and every single lesson ends with, I don't know how this always is going to look. There's a lot of speculation and conjecture, and there's a library full of books of everyone giving their opinions of what this might look like when that end comes.
Yeah.
But until then, be faithful.
Yep.
And be fruitful.
Yeah, for sure.
And those things are so. That's the task. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great crowd of witnesses, right? Let us throw off the sin that so easily entangles us, that hinders us, that holds us back. And he says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross and despised its shame, sat down at the right hand of God, the right hand of the throne of God, right? Then it says, I'm going to lose this last verse. It's the whole point. He says, so that you don't grow weary and lose heart.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like
don't grow weary.
The whole point is that you don't lose sight of who he is and what he's done for us and the mission he's got us focused on.
Yes. And that's, I just taught on this, actually at a Pakistani pastors conference in Boerne last month. I was teaching on end times and the return of Jesus. And I went into Matthew chapter 24 and looked at, as I was looking about it and praying about how to teach this, I felt like the Lord was telling me, what is in your control? And so I went through with these pastors, said, what is in your control? What is Jesus saying in here that during the end times you need to be doing? And it's be faithful. Don't be afraid.
Terrible. Everything. Heresy.
Yeah. And all he says.
Prosperity. All those things.
All these things are going to happen. And all he says is, don't be afraid. Be courageous. Stay strong in the faith. And do the Great Commission.
Do the work.
That's it. And so it's like, okay, well, why are we going to sit here and argue eschatology instead of just doing the thing that will bring about the end times?
I love the perspective altogether. I look forward to reading the book, Nicole, and I expect that you will probably have other books in the future.
I've got a few
the Lord
in the works.
Gives you a couple weeks to settle down, you might just rip out a new one and throw that out there. So that's super exciting. We're coming down to the end. So what are ways that people can pray for you, and how can they connect with you if they want to get to know you a little bit better? Obviously the website.
Yeah. So I have my website, NicoleParksWrites.com. But also I am in a new role now at Cafe 1040. So I'm the Vice President of Mobilization and Strategic Partnerships. So I'm learning this role. It's a new role to the ministry, and so therefore it's a very new role to me. I'm trying to figure out what that looks like, but we're seeing God move in a lot of powerful ways through Cafe 1040, and so people can get in touch with me through the website there. We have a podcast also, Cafe 1040 podcast, and you can follow me on Instagram, Nicole Parks Writes. Pretty involved with our Cafe 1040 Instagram account there, but yeah, I think that right now I'm in this really beautiful shift of season where I am probably going to be staying stateside a little bit more and really focused on growing the ministry that I love, that I'm a part of, through strategic partnerships and mobilization. And so we're working with different sending agencies, different churches to form these deep partnerships and really focused on the unity and diversity of the body. Like, we want to come together as a body of Christ. We can accomplish the Great Commission in our lifetime, but we can't do it if churches and ministries and people stay siloed. We've got to do it together.
And Jesus said those exact things, right?
Yeah.
Like, the better that we love each other, the stronger our witness will be to the world around us. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for making the trek out here from Atlanta. Thank you for spending 2 full days with the San Antonio and Boerne classes. And I hope that you have a wonderful time tonight. For those of you who are listening, why do we do all this? What's the point? Why do we keep talking to people and having these conversations? It's to encourage your hearts. The podcast is called So That, right? May God be gracious to us, make his face shine on us, so that his name will be known among the nations, his salvation among the earth. And so everyone that's listening, be a blessing to those who are around. God doesn't bless you just so that you'll get to go to heaven. That's a wonderful thing that he gives us, but he does it so that we can be a blessing to those around us. So be a blessing. Amen. Hope that you guys have enjoyed our podcast. Nicole, thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Hope you have a wonderful day. And those of you listening, if we can serve you in any way, if you have any comments or questions, we'd love to hear about it. We'd love to connect with you more. So reach out to us here at the church office or on our website, and we'd love to talk. Have a wonderful day, and God bless. We are so thankful that you joined our podcast today. We would love to hear any feedback you may have for us. Remember, Psalm 67 says, "May God be gracious to us and bless us, and make his face shine on us, so that your ways may be known on earth and your salvation among all nations." Don't forget why the Lord blesses us. It's so that we can be a blessing to those around us. Until next time, God bless.